The brown hen. George stood in the farmyard looking up at the roof. The old farmhouse had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tough chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting on one of the chimney pots, singing a song. The old wurzel got stuck in the attic. George thought, thank goodness for that. Suddenly, a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The song thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down. Then half of a dozen more. And then, very slowly, some wizard monster rising up from the deep Grandma's head came through the roof. Then her scrunchy neck and the top of her shoulders. How am I doing, boy? She shouted. How's that for a bad shot? Don't you think you'd better stop now, Grandma? George called out. I have stopped, she answered. I feel terrific. Didn't I tell you I had magic power? Didn't I warn you I had wizardry in the tip of my finger? But you won't listen to me, would you? You wouldn't listen to your old grandma. You didn't do it, Grandma, George shouted back to her. I did it. I made you a new medicine. A new medicine? You, what rubbish, she yelled. I did, George shouted. You're lying as usual, Grandma yelled. You're always lying. I'm not lying, Grandma. I swear I'm not. The wrinkled old face high up in the roof stared down suspiciously at George. Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself? She shouted. Yes, Grandma, all by myself. I don't believe you, she answered, but I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea. A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly, he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. Watch this, Grandma, he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon up to the hen. Chicken, he said. Chicken, come here, have some of this. Chickens are stupid birds and very greedy. They think everything is food. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over, it put its head on the one side and looked at the spoon. Come on, chicken, George said. Good chicken, chick, chick, chick. The brown hen scratched out its neck toward the spoon and went peck. Pig. It got bigful of medicine. The effort was electric. Awee! Shrieked the hen and shot straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as the house. Then down it came down into the yard. Splosh! And there it sat with its feather all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching, too. The hen got in its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making funny, gargling noises in its throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like pretty sick hen. You've done it, you stupid boy, Grandma shouted. That hen's going to die. Your father's be after you now. He'll give you socks and serve you right. All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak. It's on fire, Grandma yelled. The hen's on fire. George ran to the water to get the bucket of water. That hen will be roasted and ready for eating any moment, Grandma shouted. George splashed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound and the smoke went away. Old Hen laid the last egg. Grandma shouted. Hens don't do any laying after they've been on fire. Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly. It flipped its wings. Then it crouched down low to the ground, as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high in the air and turned a complete somersault, then landed back on its feet. It's a circus hen, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. It's flipping acrobat. Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. It's growing, he yelled. It's growing, Grandma. Look, it's growing. Bigger and bigger, taller and taller, it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. Can you see it, Grandma? George shouted. I can see it, boy, the old girl shouted back. I'm watching it. George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointing at the enormous hens and shouting, It had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did. But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nicely and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until there was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. Doesn't it look marvelous, Grandma? Grandma, George shouted. It's not as tall as me, Grandma sang out. Compared with me, that hen is teachy small. I'm the tallest of them all. The pig, the bullock, the sheep, the pony, and the nanny goat. At that moment, George's mother came back from the shopping in the village. She drove a car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. How about that, Dan, Mary? Grandma shouted. I'll bet you never see the hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is. But, stammered George's mother. It's George magic medicine, Grandma shouted. We both of us had it, the hen and I. But how in the world did you get up on the roof? Cried the mother. I didn't, crackled the old woman. My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room. This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just gargled and gasped. She looked as though she was going to faint. The second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killy Cranky. Mr. Cranky was a small man with the bandy legs and the huge hat. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with because even the smallest things got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. Great heaven! He cried, waving his arms. What's this? What happened? Where did you get from? The giant hen. Who did it? I did, George said. Look at me, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "Never mind about the hen. What about me?" Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. "Shut up, Grandma," he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He had never seen anything like that. But then, who had? "It's fantastic!" Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing around and around. "It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's a miracle. How did you do it, George?" George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, a big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went cluck, 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 cluck. Everyone stared at it. Then, when it stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of the football. "That egg would make you scramble eggs for 20 people," Mrs. Cranky said. "George," Mr. Cranky shouted, "how much of this medicine have you got?" "Lots," George said. There's a big saucepan fell in the kitchen, and these bottles are here nearly full." "Come with me," Mr. Frankie yelled, grabbing George by the arm. "Bring the medicine. For years and years, I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton." Then they went to the pasty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place. Then it grew and grew. In the end, it looked like this. Then they went to the heart of the fine black bullock that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and this is what happened. Then the sheep. He gave some of his gray pony Jack first, and finally, for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. The crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the roof, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the center of attention, and nobody was taking a slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky are running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone in the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you little beast." "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and the good thing too. But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting little worm. Fetch me a cup of tea at once and a slice of currant cake." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company to ask them to send their biggest crane out of the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. There was a wheel, and there was 2 men inside it. The crane man climbed up onto the roof and put the rope under Grandma's arm. Then she was lifted right through the roof. In In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have curled all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as freaky as ferret. As soon as the crane came lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack first, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as the house, then galloped about the farm in the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and shading and shouting, "Out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand there! Stand back! All you miserable maggots, or I'll temper you to death!" The other silly things about that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that all night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Mr. Cranky's great idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in the state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvelous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely empty the day before, because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our animals, and we've made Grandma feel as freaky as ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Frankie, "we need barrel and barrel of it, tons and tons. Then we sell it to every farmer in the world, so that all of them could have great animals. We can build a marvelous medicine factory to sell the stuff in the bottle at £5 a time. We'll become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Frankie, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why don't they?" asked George. "Because the one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Frankie, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranny. There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with the cornflakes!" cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going. And the first things we'll do is to make one more saucepanful of taster." "But Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. How can there possibly be any trouble? And you've got to do is put the same stuff into the saucepan as you did all day. And while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get a magic recipe." "But Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. And then he cried, When the new mixture is ready, we'll test out on an old hand just to make an absolutely sure we've got it right. And after that, we all shout hooray and build a giant factory. But Dad, come on then, what is it you want to say? I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the saucepan to make the medicine, George says. Of course you can, my dear boy, cried Mr. Frankie. I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get in the end. You see if you don't. Now then, what's the very first thing you put in? I went up to the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mommy's dressing table. Come on then, cried Mr. Kelly Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. When they got there, they found, of course, a hole of empty tubes and empty astral and empty bottles. That's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells you exactly what you need, what you use. If anything is not empty, it means you use it. So, Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom, and they went to Mrs. Cranny's dressing table. A box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Hell gloves, hair set, flowers of Turnus perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next? To the laundry room, George said. But are you sure you hadn't missed anything out of here, Dad? That's up to you, my boy, Mr. Cranky said. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again, Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. My goodness me, what a mess of stuff you used, she cried. No wonder it did magic things. Is that a lot? No, Grandma, it's not, George said. He led his father into the shed where the animal medicine were kept and showed him a 5 big empty bottle up in the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. Anything else? Mr. Cranky said. Little George scratched up his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Kelly Cranky leaped into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles of tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got the fresh supply of all and the animal medicine George had used. Now show me how you do it, George, he said. Come along, show me exactly how you mix them all together. Marvelous medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. Come along, my boy, cried Mr. Kelly Cranky. Which one did you put in first? This one, George said. Golden Glass hair shampoo. He emptied the bottle into the pan. Now the toothpaste, George went on, and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish. Keep at it, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. Kept putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you look. One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But then it was all done. The saucepan didn't somehow seem to quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now what do we do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long. I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he had used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work, at least not the same way." "The quarter of brown glass paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killycranky shot out of the house and into the car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and brought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the car can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right color." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling." "George, is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to us chicken." "My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down and here we're having mixed up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George, dip a couple of the saucepan and get a spoon, and we will get to the chicken just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that haven't had any of George marvelous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way chickens do. Sorry. George crouched down, holding a spoonful of marvelous medicine number 2. Come on, chicken, he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with a black specks on its feather looked up at George. He walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effort that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effort produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. "Whoosh!" squeaked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then a spark came flying out of its beak, bright yellow spark of fire, as though someone was sharpening the knife on the growstone inside its tummy. Then the legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the two thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killycranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grow, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken grew perfectly absurd with its long legs, and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my Saint Aunt!" cried Mr. Killycranky. "We've got it wrong. The chicken's not good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" "I got it," said George. What was it? Quick!" Flea powder for dogs, George said. You mean you put flea powder on the first one? Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it. That's the answer. Wait a minute, said George. Did we have brown shoe polish on our list? We did not, said Mr. Cranky. I used that too, said George. Well, no wonder it went long, said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village and buy more flea powder and more shoe polish.